You felt it. Quiet at first, maybe even like a background hum you couldn't quite name, but unmistakably real. This life doesn't fit, not because you failed at it, but because something inside you recognizes that it was never tailored for you to begin with. Deep down, you've always known that there's another version of you, one that's freer, more expansive, wealthier, not just in material, but in peace, presence, and vitality. But that version has been hidden behind layers of conditioning. You were taught to reject what you couldn't see, taught to stay loyal to comfort, to familiarity, to the loop, and so you stayed. You repeated the same thoughts, made the same choices, and lived out the same results day after day, wondering if maybe something was wrong with you. But you're not broken. Your brain was simply wired to survive, not to evolve. And that wiring is why the familiar, even when it's limiting, feels safe. That's the trap. And the moment you start feeding your energy to the past or siphoning it off into anxiety about the future, you miss the one place where everything can change, the present moment. This is where your power actually lives. This is the starting point of all transformation. Because reality, despite how solid and fixed it seems, isn't as real as you think. It's a signal. It's an ever-collapsing field of potential shaped not by circumstance, but by attention. Everything in this universe, every person, object, event, and possibility begins as a wave, a vibrating, pulsing frequency of probability. And when you focus, feel, and expect, those waves collapse into particles, into form, into your lived experience. You don't just witness reality, you generate it. So when your frequency shifts, you don't just influence your future, you create it. This isn't just self-help. This is the system override that was never meant to be common knowledge. Because once you get this, once you feel it not just in your mind but in your cells, your whole world starts responding differently. Reality bends, not to wishful thinking, but to conscious alignment. You ever look around and think, there's no way this is all there is? That ache in your gut isn't delusion, it's data. It's proof that the life you're imagining isn't a fantasy. It's a version of reality that already exists, and the wildest part is, you can shift into it. That version of your life, the one you see when you close your eyes and exhale, isn't fiction. It's real, already out there, already vibrating. And no, this isn't about wishful mantras or positivity posters taped to your mirror. This is rooted in physics, neuroscience, consciousness studies, the kind of work people like Tesla, Einstein, Jung, and Neville Goddard spent their lives exploring. This isn't about faith in magic. It's about understanding the machinery behind creation. And once you do, you stop trying to force life to change. You start tuning into the version that was waiting for you to remember how. But to do that, you first have to unlearn what you thought was true. So let's strip it all back. What is reality? The job you have, the people you know, the money you make, even the emotions that seem to define your personality, none of that is fixed. It's not absolute. It's a version, a rendering, a filtered experience shaped entirely by your consciousness. And consciousness, it doesn't just ride along for the journey, it steers the ship. Reality isn't this hard, external object you bump up against. It's fluid, responsive, elastic, not Newtonian, quantum, not push-pull, not effort-outcome, but wave-function collapse. At the quantum level, everything you see is vibrating with potential. It's not solid, it's not even real in the way we think of real. It's probabilities, wave patterns waiting to be observed, and that's the kicker. It's not your actions that collapse them. It's your observation, your belief, your expectation. The moment you focus your consciousness on a potential, you trigger its collapse into form. Matter itself is just energy observed into place. So what does that make you? Not a bag of skin and bones, not a static object bumping through time, but a living transmitter, a fragment of infinite awareness that shapes reality by tuning your inner state. And time? Time is the biggest illusion of all. We experience it linearly, past, present, future, because our bodies are built that way. But your consciousness isn't bound by those rules. It exists beyond time in what physicists call non-local awareness. That means your future isn't some distant place. It's accessible now, right here, if you can shift your lens. Imagine this. You're watching a movie with red-tinted glasses. The scenes play out in warm tones. But if you change to blue-tinted ones, the same movie suddenly feels colder, darker, more intense. The movie didn't change. Your lens did. That's how your consciousness works. It doesn't just interpret reality, it colors it, it sculpts it, it responds to what it's tuned to. And the craziest part? That lens, your beliefs, your emotions, your assumptions, might not just be filtering the story, it might be shaping it. If that sounds too wild to accept, let me introduce you to the double-slit experiment. This experiment flipped the entire scientific world on its head. Tiny particles, electrons, were fired at a wall through two slits. When no one was observing, they behaved like waves. They spread out, interfered with each other, passed through both slits at once. But the moment a conscious observer was added, boom, they behaved like particles. They picked a path. They acted as if they knew they were being watched. Let that sink in. Observation changed the outcome. Consciousness collapsed potential into form. And Einstein, the man most known for his devotion to order and logic, hated it. He said, "God does not play dice with the universe." But even he couldn't ignore the results, because the evidence was undeniable. Consciousness changes reality, and if the building blocks of the universe respond this way to awareness, then the idea that your thoughts, focus, and beliefs shape your life isn't just hopeful, it's probable. Now let's take it further. Your attention isn't passive. It's not a flashlight. It's a quantum trigger. Every time you focus on something, whether it's fear, lack, hope, or vision, you collapse one possibility into the physical world. That means attention is currency. Attention is creation. And that's why every algorithm, every app, every product on Earth is designed to hijack it, because those who control your attention control your signal. And when you give that signal to fear, doubt, scarcity, and failure, what do you think collapses? Not because the universe is punishing you, but because it's obedient. It responds to what you observe most consistently. So when you spiral into old pain, obsess about what's missing, or focus on the worst-case scenario, you're not stuck. You're just selecting. And most of the time, you don't even realize you're doing it. But some did. And they tried to tell us. Tesla, one of the most brilliant minds in history, said, "If you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." He wasn't being poetic. He was giving you the code. Tesla believed your consciousness wasn't just a passive observer. It was a transmitter, sending out signals in the form of thoughts and emotions that shape the field around you. Fast forward to Carl Jung, who wasn't a physicist, but understood the architecture of the human psyche. He gave us the concept of synchronicity, those strange moments when life feels too perfectly timed to be coincidence. You think of someone, they call, you change your mindset, a job shows up, you shift your energy, and suddenly new paths open. These weren't flukes to him. They were evidence of a deeper order, a connected field responding to your internal state. You don't force life, you tune into it. And now let's add the modern lens. Neuroscience tells us your brain isn't just recording reality, it's predicting it. It filters out 95% of what's actually around you and only shows you what it expects. That's why once you start focusing on something, like a new car, a type of opportunity, or a shift in identity, you start seeing signs of it everywhere. Not because they suddenly appeared, because your filter changed, because your brain started allowing in data it used to ignore. This is called selective perception, and it means your experience of life isn't random, it's curated by you. Let's connect the dots. Quantum physics says observation collapses potential into form. Psychology says perception shapes your experience. Neuroscience says your attention determines what you see and how you act. So if your inner world is the driver, then shifting your life isn't about changing the outside. It's about changing the lens. And that change, the shift, isn't theoretical. It's mechanical, emotional, biological, quantum. It's real. And the moment you start applying it, not just once, but repeatedly, something begins to move. Not just in your mood, in your world. You feel it, you see it. People react differently. Opportunities start to cluster. You feel less resistance, more flow. Because you've tuned your signal to a different frequency. And life, being the obedient mirror that it is, has no choice but to reflect it back. So how does this shift from theory to practice? What actually happens when you begin to treat your reality as fluid instead of fixed? When you stop asking for permission and start embodying the version of yourself that already lives the life you want? It looks like a quiet rebellion, not against society, but against the old programming inside you. That version of you who settles, who fears, who second guesses, starts to dissolve. And what replaces it isn't a fantasy, but a recalibration, a new pattern emerging in how you think, how you feel, and how you move. Reality begins to soften, not with fanfare, but with subtle openings. You notice the resistance is lighter, your confidence comes sooner. You no longer negotiate with fear before every decision. That's how you know the shift has begun. Not because the world has changed, but because you've stopped living on autopilot. You're no longer reacting. You're tuning, aligning, adjusting the dial. And like a radio, the clearer the frequency, the more vivid the music. That life you've been imagining starts sending back signals. Not just signs and synchronicities, but actual changes. Conversations that feel different. Doors that open without force. And while most people would call this coincidence or luck, you know the truth. It's alignment. You're no longer begging reality to notice you. You've become magnetic to the timeline you once thought was out of reach. But let's anchor this in something undeniable. A real-world example that everyone knows but rarely dissects. In 1954, Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile barrier. Before that, scientists, trainers, and athletes believed it was physiologically impossible. The human body, they said, just wasn't built for it. It wasn't just unlikely. It was a limit carved into the collective belief system. Until he did it. And then, within months, dozens of other runners did the same. What changed? Not their lungs, not their legs. The collective frequency shifted. The idea of what was possible collapsed into a new reality. A boundary wasn't just pushed, it was erased. This is quantum. This is what happens when someone observes a new version of reality and aligns with it so completely that the field adapts to match it. That's not motivational fluff. That's how the wave collapses. Bannister didn't wait for proof. He became the proof. And once he did, the world bent around his example. This is what quantum shifting really means. Not skipping the work, not escaping struggle, but aligning your identity with a new version of existence so completely that it cannot help but solidify into your external experience. Let's break this down even further. In quantum physics, we have this concept of superposition. It means particles exist in multiple potential states until one of them is observed. That's not just a fascinating property of atoms, it's a metaphor for your life. Right now, your future isn't fixed. It's a field, a web of probabilities, all available, all real, all waiting to be chosen. The version where you're stuck and the version where you're thriving both exist. Which one collapses into your reality depends on where you aim your focus, your emotion, and your belief. Think of it like a radio tower again. You're surrounded by hundreds of stations, but you only hear one, the one your dial is tuned to. Most people walk through life stuck on one channel, not because it's the only one, but because it's the only one they believe is real. But when you start shifting your signal, when you start feeling, thinking, and acting from the frequency of a different outcome, you begin to match that new station. You don't force the music, you receive it, you become it. So how is this different from positive thinking? That's a valid question. The answer lies in the difference between wishing and being. Quantum shifting isn't about affirming a new life from a place of lack. It's about embodying it from a place of already having it. It's not about saying, I want abundance while feeling broke. It's about becoming the version of you who moves through the world with ease, trust, and value. Neville Goddard captured this beautifully when he said, change your conception of yourself, and you will automatically change the world in which you live. He didn't say, hope harder. He said, shift identity. Because reality doesn't respond to words. It responds to state. And state isn't what you say. It's what you are. You can say, I am powerful 100 times, but if your body is tight with fear and your thoughts are swimming in doubt, you're still tuned to limitation. But the moment you feel the shift, the moment you breathe differently, carry yourself differently, respond instead of react, you've changed the channel. You've collapsed a new timeline. And now, your actions are no longer resistance-filled efforts to escape. They're extensions of who you've become. That's the turning point. When your behavior starts to emerge from identity rather than insecurity, you no longer force yourself to work hard. You're pulled by clarity. You don't second-guess every conversation. You embody the presence of someone who knows their value. That internal shift isn't just mental. It's electromagnetic. Your heart emits a measurable frequency. Your brain, when focused, synchronizes its waves, and together your nervous system becomes a transmitter of intention. That's not woo. That's bioelectricity. And science is finally catching up. Let's bring in modern neuroscience now. Your brain is designed for change. It's not hardwired. It's plastic. Neuroplasticity means that your brain reorganizes itself based on what you think and repeat. And here's the kicker. When you vividly imagine something, your brain doesn't distinguish it from a real experience. That's right. When you rehearse success, your neurons fire as if it's happening. Your body produces the hormones. Your system adjusts. That's not visualization as fantasy. That's visualization as installation. You're not pretending. You're preparing. Your nervous system begins to recognize the future before it arrives. And when it does, it doesn't feel like a miracle. It feels familiar. That's the power of repetition. Not in effort, but in frequency calibration. Let's go deeper. There's something called the quantum Zeno effect. It's a principle that says repeated observation of a system can freeze its evolution. That's right. You can stop something from changing just by focusing on it continuously. Scientists found that when they watched a quantum particle over and over, it stopped moving. It got stuck. And that explains so much about why people repeat the same life over and over. You're not cursed, you're not unlucky. You're over-observing the old story. You keep focusing on what's wrong, what's missing, what didn't work. And that locks the timeline in place. You're collapsing the same limited outcome again and again, not because it's your fate, but because it's what you keep watching. But the moment you shift your gaze, the moment you start feeding energy into the version you want instead of the version you fear, the system begins to change. The evolution resumes. A new wave begins to collapse. That's why meditation works. Not because it calms you, but because it gives you access to the subconscious without resistance. And when you pair meditation with elevated emotion, gratitude, joy, love, you're not just relaxing, you're coding. You're rewriting the chemical and energetic state of your entire being. That's quantum neurobiology, and it doesn't take years. A single elevated state felt fully can change your trajectory. But consistency is the key. You have to install the new pattern before the old one reasserts itself, because the default will try to pull you back. The old identity has gravity, and you'll feel it. Those moments when doubt creeps in, when the old voice says, "Who do you think you are?" That's not a sign to stop. That's proof that the system is shifting. The noise gets loudest when you're breaking the pattern. So how do you know it's working? That's the next question most people ask. If the outside hasn't changed yet, how can you trust the process? The answer is this: the internal always shifts before the external. And your emotional signals are your proof. You feel different. You catch yourself responding calmly to things that used to trigger you. You move through the day with a subtle steadiness that wasn't there before. That's not small, that's your nervous system recalibrating. And then the synchronicities begin. The book you needed shows up. A message arrives out of nowhere. Someone offers help unexpectedly. These aren't random. These are signals from the field. Feedback that your frequency is being heard. But the moment you doubt them, the signal weakens. The moment you say, "It's just a coincidence," you undo the collapse. So trust them, acknowledge them, anchor them. They're not the goal, they're the markers. You're on the path. Now let's talk about what most people get wrong. They start the shift, feel the spark, but then try to force it. They grasp, cling, chase. And in doing so, they activate the signal of lack. You can't force alignment. You surrender into it. Detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you trust. You've sent the signal. You're holding the frequency. Now, let the field respond in its timing. Think of it like ordering a package online. You don't refresh the page every second, wondering if the delivery truck got lost. You know it's coming. So you go about your day preparing for it. That's quantum trust. And it's not passive, it's powerful. It keeps your signal clean. And the field, which doesn't speak language but responds perfectly to energy, begins to rearrange itself around your coherence. And just when you think nothing's happening, it does. Subtle at first, the way someone looks at you, the way ideas start flowing again, the way you feel when you wake up. Not dreading, not dragging, but alert. That's the shift. That's the moment your identity is no longer waiting for proof. It has become the proof. And now your choices, your actions, your voice all move with a different cadence. People feel it. Not because you told them, but because energy doesn't lie. You've tuned to a new channel, and life, obedient as ever, begins to match it. So what happens next, once you've begun feeling the shift? Once your inner world starts stabilizing around a new identity, a new frequency, that's when everything outside of you begins its slow, almost imperceptible response. Not always in fireworks, not always with celebration, but in unmistakable realignment. People who once drained you begin to fall away. Conversations change, your decisions become cleaner. You stop apologizing for your clarity. That confusion that once blurred every choice begins to lift. And in its place is not a sudden certainty, but something quieter, a knowing, a resonance, a subtle alignment with a future version of yourself who no longer chases, no longer doubts, no longer hesitates. And that is not because your world has become easy. It's because your identity has evolved. You've become more than just someone seeking change. You've become the version who lives it. And the field around you, the invisible web of possibility, begins to weave itself differently because of that. This is the part where most people want a checklist. They want a sequence of steps that guarantees transformation. But quantum shifting doesn't obey linearity. It flows with coherence, with embodiment. You become the new story by living it, by staying with the identity even when the world hasn't caught up yet. Especially when it hasn't caught up yet. That's the test. And so now the practice deepens. Because once the identity starts to lock in, the universe will send friction. Not as punishment, but as calibration. The old story resurfaces. Doubt whispers again. You might face unexpected challenges, and some part of you will want to ask, is this working? But here's the truth. The test is the sign. The challenge isn't a derailment. It's a final offer from the old timeline to see if you'll take it back. Your job is to hold the frequency anyway, to stay in state, not to ignore reality, but to reinterpret it. When the unexpected comes, the question isn't, why is this happening? The question is, how would my future self respond to this? Because the more you act from that future self in the present moment, the faster that version of reality begins to take root. You shift not by pretending, you shift by practicing, again and again. You stop looking at your current bank account and instead act from the energy of someone whose value isn't defined by a number. You stop measuring your worth by who texts you back, who validates your work, who agrees with your path. Because your frequency no longer depends on approval. It moves from alignment. And now the layers begin to peel. You start to see the structures beneath the surface. That the reason your old identity felt so permanent was because it was backed by years of emotional repetition. Pain rehearsed until it became personality. Trauma mistaken for truth. You start to realize your story was never just about what happened. It was about how often you told it, how many times you fed it with attention, with emotion, with language. And now, the new story requires the same nourishment, not with force, but with focus. You start scripting a different narrative, not just on paper, but in tone, in posture, in how you show up to the world each day. You speak differently, not with false bravado, but with embodied clarity. You walk into rooms and your energy says more than your mouth ever could. People feel it, because coherence is felt. And as that coherence deepens, opportunities that once seemed distant begin to orbit closer. Not because you forced them, but because your signal shifted. At this stage, the practice is not about more effort. It's about more alignment. It's about emotional precision. About being honest when you slip into doubt, but then using that awareness to recalibrate. Every moment becomes a choice point, not a burden, but an opportunity to react from the past or respond from the future. And when you begin to choose the latter consistently, something powerful happens. Your nervous system starts to stabilize. The fight or flight response begins to quiet. Your breath slows. Your decisions no longer come from panic or survival, but from vision. And now, the identity you once visualized has begun to crystallize. Not because the world made it happen, but because you refuse to return to the old version of yourself. You didn't wait for evidence. You became it. Let's take this further, because science isn't silent here either. Epigenetics shows us that our genes don't control our destiny. Our environment does. And that environment isn't just external, it's internal too. Your thoughts, your beliefs, your emotions, They all create the biochemical conditions that influence gene expression. So when Dr. Bruce Lipton says, "The moment you change your perception is the moment you rewrite the chemistry of your body," he isn't speaking metaphorically. He's stating a biological fact. You are not a prisoner of your DNA. You are the conductor, and your thoughts are the baton. Change the signal, and your biology responds. You're not locked in by what you inherited. You're influenced by what you choose to focus on. That means every time you choose gratitude over stress, calm over chaos, empowerment over fear, you're not just improving your mood, you're rewriting your body's chemistry. You're changing the cellular environment that determines health, energy, immunity, even longevity. That's not spiritual speculation, that's biophysics. And if we go even deeper into research, we find something even more radical. Princeton University's PEAR lab, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, spent decades studying whether human intention could influence machines. And after millions of trials, they concluded something stunning. Focused thought, sustained intention, skewed the output of random number generators. It shouldn't have. It wasn't supposed to. But it did. Again and again. They found that consciousness isn't just a byproduct of the brain. It might be a field, a force that can influence matter. And now with researchers like Dean Radin continuing this work, we see experiments where meditation, intention, and emotion measurably affect the physical world. Is it controversial? Yes. But the results are consistent. Your mind is not confined to your skull. Your signal is non-local. And the more coherent it becomes, the more it seems to interact with the world around you. But even if you don't fully buy that, consider this. You've already experienced it. You've thought of someone and they called. You've shifted your mindset and something opened. You've walked into a room and felt an energy that wasn't spoken, but was undeniable. That's not superstition. That's entrainment. That's field interaction. And when you combine that with the placebo effect, the most documented example of belief-changing biology, the picture becomes clearer. People heal from sugar pills, not because the pill worked, but because they believed it would. Belief becomes biology. And the inverse is true too. The nocebo effect, when belief harms instead of heals, is just as powerful. People decline, deteriorate, or die because they believe they will. Not because the condition was fatal, but because the expectation was. There are stories, many of them verified, of patients who were told they had terminal illnesses and died right on schedule, only for autopsies to reveal that the diagnosis was wrong. They didn't die from disease, they died from belief. So when we talk about quantum shifting, we're not talking about superstition. We're talking about a convergence of physics, biology, psychology, and personal practice. We're talking about the mechanics of belief, about the frequency of identity, about the emotional signal that creates your experience. And once you see that, once you really see it, you can't unsee it. The old game falls apart. You stop outsourcing your power to circumstances. You stop waiting for luck or validation. You stop thinking the external world needs to change before you can feel different. And instead, you turn inward, not as an escape, as a calibration. You begin to align your thoughts with your intentions, your emotions with your vision, your actions with your future self. And in doing so, you send a coherent signal to the field, one that says, I'm no longer waiting. I've already shifted. And here's the wild part. Once you do that, the world around you doesn't just notice, it starts adjusting. Because you are no longer tuned to your old frequency, and energy always seeks coherence. That's why people treat you differently when your confidence is real. Why opportunities open when your signal is clear. It's not magic, it's resonance. Like two tuning forks vibrating at the same pitch, The world begins to harmonize with the identity you hold, and now you've stopped reacting. You've become the conductor. Your past no longer holds the pen. You do, and every thought, every breath, every choice, every word, it all writes the new story, not as fantasy, but as fact in progress. That's the power you hold. That's the shift, and it's happening right now. So what do you do with this power now that you understand it? You don't wait for some external moment of permission. You begin living from the identity that knows this truth. You begin turning your attention into a tool, your emotion into a sculptor, and your thoughts into levers. You stop measuring your growth by what you see and begin measuring it by what you feel. You learn to value the internal evidence over the external delay, and in doing so, you become something most people never even consider possible: aligned. Not perfectly, not constantly, but often enough to change the trajectory of your life. The shift becomes less about trying and more about remembering. You stop striving to become and instead practice being. And this is the space where reality begins to flow differently. You wake up and the voice in your head has changed. It no longer attacks or doubts or drags you into familiar self-punishment. It speaks more clearly, more gently, with authority that doesn't come from superiority, but from wholeness. You start feeling what it means to live in state, not the state of your circumstances, but the state of your intention. And it's in that state where you create the most, not just outcomes, but the conditions that lead to them. You become a source of coherence in your own field, and that coherence, in turn, creates effects. And still, people will misunderstand you. They'll ask what you're doing differently. They'll see that something about you has shifted, but they won't be able to name it. You'll smile and nod, but you won't explain because there's nothing to prove. The shift is in how you walk into the room, not how you describe it. And you will still be tested. Make no mistake, quantum shifting is not an escape from the human experience. It's a deeper way of engaging with it. The bills won't vanish, the disappointments won't evaporate, but your relationship to them transforms. You stop meeting them with contraction and start responding with direction. Challenges become invitations. Resistance becomes feedback. You don't crumble when life gets hard. You adjust your frequency and continue. You don't panic when plans fall apart. You interpret the feedback and choose again. That's how quantum living feels. It's not a high or a buzz. It's not constant euphoria. It's stable, grounded, embodied. It's when your inner world becomes so ordered, so deliberate, that the external chaos no longer derails you. So how do you maintain this state when the world tries to pull you back? Through daily reinforcement, not through obsession, but through calibration. You begin building practices that strengthen the signal. You script your reality not because you're hoping it'll come true, but because your nervous system begins to believe it when you write it with enough emotion. You write about your life from the place of already living it. You describe it in present tense with vivid sensory details. You feel it, taste it, walk through it in your imagination like a scene you've already experienced, and then you go out and act in ways that match it. You start behaving like the version of yourself who already lives that story. Not because you're delusional, but because you're aligning. You're training your brain, your body, your emotional field to respond to that version as if it's real. And the more often you do this, the easier it becomes. The signal strengthens, the doubts weaken, your decisions sharpen, and the shift goes from something you practice occasionally to something you embody daily. You also begin using your environment as an ally. You put reminders in your space. You surround yourself with visuals and symbols that anchor your future identity. You curate your inputs. You stop watching media that lowers your frequency. You remove conversations that pull you back into old patterns. Not because you're avoiding life, but because you're choosing your alignment. You begin saying no faster. You honor your boundaries, not from ego, but from resonance. You don't chase approval because you've stopped outsourcing validation. You've made the internal shift, and the external world becomes a mirror of that. The people you attract change. The opportunities you see shift. The obstacles you face become different, not fewer, but more aligned with growth. Because now you're living as the version of you who invites challenge with clarity, not fear. The version who knows that friction is part of expansion. This is the point where most people look around and ask, is this it? Am I doing it right? And that question comes from a place of measurement. But quantum shifting is not about measuring results, it's about matching identity. So instead of asking if it's working, ask yourself how often you're living from the version of you who already has what you desire. Are your decisions aligned with that version? Are your thoughts consistent with that reality? Are your emotions calibrated to that frequency? That's how you know. The feedback loop is internal first, and the more consistent you are, the more undeniable the external shifts become. The synchronicities grow stronger, the signs become clearer, the resistance begins to dissolve, and you start to realize something that changes everything. You were never trying to make reality different. You were only trying to remember that you had the power to align with it. And then comes the next layer, embodiment. You stop needing the practices to feel the identity. You become the identity. You no longer need to visualize abundance to feel secure. You feel secure because you've rewired your nervous system to believe it. You no longer need to imagine love to feel worthy. You feel worthy because you no longer tolerate anything less, and your actions reflect that. You invest differently. You speak differently. You move differently. You begin to honor your time as sacred. You stop explaining yourself. You stop over-apologizing. Because your self-concept has changed, not on a surface level, but on a structural one. And that shift radiates. People notice it. They might not be able to name it, but they respond to it. Because frequency doesn't lie. And that's when reality begins to catch up, not as a fluke, not as a stroke of luck, but as a mirror. You start seeing evidence of the shift, not just in moments, but in patterns. Opportunities that match your frequency show up more frequently. People who reflect your values enter your life. You find yourself drawn to environments, decisions, and paths that feel aligned, not forced. And all of this happens not because you hacked the universe, but because you tuned into a version of it that was already available. And now that you've shifted, the world around you adjusts. Not overnight, not always dramatically, but undeniably. And this is the most profound truth of it all. You realize that you are not chasing your dream life. You are remembering it, reclaiming it. You are no longer hoping it finds you. You are aligning with it. Because in the quantum field, all possibilities exist. And the one you choose to live isn't created by accident. It's selected by frequency, by identity, by how you think, feel, and act consistently. That's the power. That's the key. That's the shift. And now, you no longer need to be convinced. You've felt it. You've seen the feedback. You've become the signal. And the more you live in that space, the more natural it feels. It doesn't mean you won't slip, you will. You'll have days where doubt creeps back in, where fear knocks. But the difference now is that you don't spiral. You notice, you recalibrate, you return to state, and each time you do, the muscle gets stronger, the shift becomes more permanent, the identity more embodied, the reality more responsive, and soon you're not just creating a life you want, you're becoming someone who can hold it, sustain it, expand it, because the true quantum shift is never about what you get, it's about who you become to receive it, And you, right now, are becoming that version. Not in the future, not someday, but now. Now you've crossed the line. You're no longer just dabbling in change or circling the perimeter of your potential. You've stepped into the architecture of a new life. You're not a tourist of transformation anymore. You're building your home here. The shift is no longer something you reach for. It's something you return to, something you rely on. And even though the outside world might still look similar, your internal atmosphere has changed so completely that it's only a matter of time before the external reflects it. You begin waking up without the old heaviness. You stop asking what's wrong and start asking what's possible. You walk through your day like you belong in your body again. You stop begging for signs because you've become the evidence. That voice that used to scream fear in your ear now whispers clarity. That feeling of being small in your own story dissolves, and in its place is sovereignty, quiet, unshakable sovereignty. You don't announce your evolution to anyone, you just live it, and those who can feel it do. And now you realize that the shift was never about getting the perfect partner, or the dream job, or the big bank account. Those were just doorways. The real shift was internal. You wanted those things because of how you thought they'd make you feel valued, safe, seen, powerful. And then you realized that you could feel those things now, not as a lie, but as a recalibration. You stopped waiting to be chosen. You chose yourself. You stopped auditioning for love. You became the source of it. And because of that, your decisions changed. You no longer chase, you attract, not with effort, but with frequency. You stopped trying to force doors open. You became the version of yourself for whom those doors naturally open. You stopped reaching and started remembering. You remembered what it felt like to be connected to something infinite, something intelligent, something that responds to coherence, not desperation. So you started living like it. You started doing things differently, not dramatically but decisively. You spoke with conviction. You moved with purpose. You stopped explaining your worth and started expressing it. And slowly, everything began to adjust. Your relationships grew deeper or fell away entirely. Your work started reflecting your values. The way people looked at you shifted. Not because you became more, but because you remembered who you were before you forgot. The truth is, the real shift was never about creating a new self. It was about shedding the layers that obscured your original signal, the one that was always worthy, always powerful, always connected. You didn't become someone else. You just stopped pretending you weren't who you always were. And now, the future feels less like a mystery and more like a choice. You're not trying to predict it, you're aligning with it. You're not reacting to circumstances, you're responding from clarity. You're not attached to outcomes, you're grounded in identity. You know that the version of your life you want doesn't live in a fantasy. It lives in the field. And your role is not to chase it, but to tune into it so clearly that it collapses into form. You've stopped outsourcing your power. You've reclaimed it from the projections of others, from the old traumas, from the societal templates that never fit you in the first place. You stopped asking for permission to want more. You stopped apologizing for your potential. And that decision, that internal switch, is what activated the shift. But here's the paradox. The more you live from this frequency, the less you need proof. The more you trust the unseen, not blindly, but intuitively, because you've seen what happens when you show up from coherence. You've felt how people respond to your energy before you even speak. You've watched opportunities magnetized to you without manipulation. And now, you're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're just becoming the kind of person for whom The life you want is inevitable. You no longer care if others understand, because the alignment itself is the reward. The embodiment is the proof. The peace you carry is louder than any explanation. And now your questions shift. You stop asking, how do I get that? And start asking, who do I need to be to hold that? You stop measuring time by clocks and start measuring it by momentum. You realize that being in state isn't something you visit, it's something you live. And yes, you'll still feel resistance. Yes, the world will still test you. But now you have tools, you have awareness, you have the ability to pause and breathe and choose again. You know how to catch the old pattern mid-thought and replace it with presence. You know how to observe your reactions without becoming them. You've trained your system to return to coherence. And that means even when life throws its hardest lessons, you don't spiral, you don't collapse. You calibrate, you shift again and again and again. Because quantum shifting isn't a one-time event. It's a lifestyle, a discipline, a devotion. It's the decision to live in resonance with the version of yourself that already knows, the version that doesn't chase timelines but tunes into them, that doesn't fear change but initiates it, that doesn't resist growth but expands into it. And as you keep living this way, you'll begin to notice something beautiful. Your world starts moving with you. The delays become divine, the losses become lessons, the pauses become preparation. You no longer judge the journey, you trust it, because you understand that every detour was part of the design, that every closed door was protection, that every setback was a setup for greater alignment. And so you stop rushing, you stop gripping, you start flowing, not with passivity, but with power. And one day, almost suddenly, you realize that everything you thought you needed to become was already inside you. The wealth, the clarity, the love, the certainty. You didn't have to chase it. You had to align with it. And now, it's not about the next breakthrough or the next manifestation. It's about staying in resonance. It's about choosing state before circumstance, identity before outcome, frequency before evidence. You've become the version of yourself that lives from the shift, and that version can't be faked. It can't be mimicked. It can't be copied, because it's yours. Earned not by struggle, but by presence. Built not by effort alone, but by alignment. Lived not as an escape from reality, but as a redefinition of it. So now every breath is a choice. Every moment is a portal. You realize the smallest shift in emotion, the quietest elevation in thought, the subtlest act of integrity. It all shapes your trajectory. Nothing is wasted. Every micro-alignment echoes. Every decision made from your future self sends ripples through the field. You're no longer waiting for the big moment. You are the big moment. You don't need proof anymore. You are the proof. And anyone who truly sees you, who truly feels you, will know. Not because you told them, because you've become a different frequency. One that can't be ignored, one that can't be dimmed, one that was always there, just waiting for you to stop playing small and step into it fully. And that's the real shift. Not just that you understand the science or the philosophy or the practice, but that you live it. You live it in the way you love people, in the way you speak to yourself, in the way you show up when no one's watching. You live it in the stillness of your mornings, in the integrity of your yes, in the boundaries of your no, in the way you respond when life surprises you, in the way you choose expansion, even when it would be easier to shrink. Because now you know that every thought, every word, every feeling, every choice, it's all signal. And you are no longer broadcasting from fear or scarcity or lack, You are broadcasting from truth, from worth, from wholeness. You've shifted. And that doesn't mean the journey ends here. It means it finally begins. Because now you're not climbing the mountain to prove anything. You're walking the path because it's who you are, because your frequency won't let you settle, because you've remembered that this life, this incredible, fleeting, sacred life, was never meant to be lived in the shadow of doubt. It was meant to be illuminated by your full, unapologetic, coherent, aligned self. And now that you've remembered how to shift, now that you've lived it, you will never go back. Not because you can't, but because you won't. You've seen what alignment feels like. You've tasted your potential. And now nothing less will satisfy. So go, keep choosing it, keep living it. Keep becoming the version of yourself who doesn't wait for the future, but collapses it into now. Because the shift doesn't happen to you, it happens through you. And once it begins, there's no stopping it, only deepening it, only refining it, only rising again and again into the version of yourself that reality has been waiting for you to remember all along.